When you look deeply at the human condition, you find that the greatest struggle is not with the world outside, it's with the world within. Every day, we wrestle with our own ego, our own impulses, our own insecurities, and the endless craving for control. And the irony is that the more we try to control everything around us, the more trapped we become inside ourselves. That is why true freedom doesn't begin when the world changes. It begins when the ego is humbled. And there is no act that humbles the ego more profoundly, more completely, more beautifully than bowing to Allah. Because when a person bows, they are admitting a truth that the ego refuses to accept, that we are created, dependent, limited. This acknowledgement is not humiliation, it is liberation. It frees you from the exhausting burden of pretending you have it all figured out. It frees you from the pressure of always being strong, always being right, always being in control. Sajda is where you finally allow yourself to be human, weak before Allah, but strong through Allah. And once the ego releases its grip, the heart can finally breathe. Psychologically, this act of surrender is transformative. When the ego steps aside, you begin to see life with clarity. You recognize that not everything is about you, that not every situation is a threat to your self-worth, that not every criticism must be defended. The constant battle to preserve your image, your pride, your reputation, it becomes less compelling. Because the one who bows to Allah does not need the world to validate them. They already know who they are. They already know whose pleasure they are seeking. That knowledge alone dissolves so much of the anxiety, comparison, and insecurity that dominates modern life. Philosophically, Sajda solves a deeper problem, the illusion of autonomy. We convince ourselves that we are self-sufficient, that our success belongs to us, that our intelligence, our opportunities, our achievements are the result of our own hands. But bowing to Allah shatters that illusion in a single moment. It realigns you with reality. The reality that everything you have, everything you are, comes from a source far beyond you. This realization doesn't diminish your worth. It elevates it. Because when you understand your dependence on the Creator, you also understand the immense honor of being guided, sustained, and cared for by Him. And that is where freedom lies. When you let go of the ego, you let go of the fear that comes with it. Fear of failure, fear of judgment, fear of loss, fear of not being enough. These fears are born from the fragile ego. But the heart that bows to Allah does not shake with the same tremors. It stands firm. It becomes anchored. You begin to live with a certain quiet confidence, a dignity that doesn't need to be loud, a strength that doesn't need to be seen. You become free from the world because the world no longer defines you. And if you think about it, this is one of the great paradoxes of faith. Lowering your head to Allah raises your entire being. Surrendering your ego gives you a stronger identity. Admitting your weakness makes you resilient. A single sajda can liberate you from years of emotional weight, because it reconnects you to the one who controls everything you were trying to control on your own. So the next time your ego pushes you toward pride, toward defensiveness, toward proving yourself, pause for a moment and remember that freedom is not in winning the battle of the ego. It is in bowing. And when you bow to Allah with sincerity, the world loses its power over you. True freedom begins the moment your forehead touches the ground. If you reflect on what sajda actually does to the human being, you begin to realize that it's not merely a physical posture. It is a complete internal reset. In a world where our minds are overloaded with information, our hearts crowded with emotion, and our lives filled with pressure, sajda becomes a sanctuary. It is the one moment where everything that feels scattered begins to come back into alignment. Your thoughts slow down, your breathing softens, and your heart finds rhythm again. It is as if bowing before Allah reorganizes the chaos inside you. From a psychological perspective, this is profound. Modern anxiety largely comes from living in a state of constant mental clutter. We're pulled in 100 directions, distracted yet exhausted, stimulated yet numb. Sajda interrupts that cycle. It forces the body into stillness, and the mind follows. The position itself lowers your physical elevation, grounding you, anchoring you in the present moment. Neuroscientists speak about grounding techniques to calm the mind. Believers have been doing this for centuries through bowing to their Creator. Sajda draws you out of the spiral of overthinking and places you in a space of pure surrender, where the mind stops trying to control the uncontrollable and finally rests. But beyond the psychology, there is a deeper philosophical truth embedded in this moment. Sajda reorders your priorities without needing words. It is a silent reminder of what matters and what doesn't. When your forehead touches the ground, your worries don't disappear, but their scale changes. The problem that felt overwhelming 10 minutes ago looks smaller when placed under the greatness of Allah. The grief that felt heavy becomes lighter when you realize you're not carrying it alone. The decisions that felt impossible suddenly feel manageable because you're consulting the one who knows the unseen. Sajda clarifies your lens. It brings your heart and mind back into their rightful position. And there's something remarkable about how this act reconnects the inner self. Human beings often feel detached from their purpose, from their faith, even from themselves. Sajda bridges that detachment. It is the point where the heart reveals itself honestly. There are things you cannot say to people, but you can express them to Allah in a single moment of prostration without speaking a word. The weight you cannot articulate is released simply by lowering your head. It is the ultimate form of emotional transparency, of vulnerability that brings healing rather than harm. On a spiritual level, sajda is the closest a servant can be to their Lord. That closeness has a transformative effect. It softens hard hearts, it cleanses resentment, it dissolves arrogance, it quiets the internal noise. It opens the doorway to clarity. Not the clarity that comes from having every answer, but the clarity that comes from trusting the one who holds every answer. When clarity enters the heart, decision-making becomes easier, patience becomes more natural, and gratitude becomes instinctive. Your whole internal system becomes recalibrated. This is why sajda is more than a ritual. It becomes a kind of therapy. Not in the superficial sense of a temporary relief, but in the deep sense of reconfiguring what you feel, how you think, and who you choose to become. A person who regularly makes sincere sajda develops a certain emotional stability. They learn to respond instead of react. They learn to pause before being overwhelmed. They learn to see life not through the lens of fear, but through the lens of tawakkul. They begin to understand that peace is not found by escaping life, but by grounding your heart in the one who created life. And that is the power of sajda. It doesn't change your circumstances, but it changes you. And once you change, everything else begins to shift with it. So, the next time you enter sajda, don't rush it. Let your heart descend with your body. Let your mind quiet itself in His presence. Because in that single moment of bowing, you are being realigned back to the person you were always meant to be. Sajda is where your heart returns home, if you allow it to. One of the most remarkable consequences of bowing to Allah is the internal strength. It creates the kind of strength no amount of worldly success can give. A person who has tasted the sweetness of true submission understands something profound. When you bow to the Creator, you refuse to bow to creation. You stop living under the shadow of people's expectations, opinions, and judgments. You stop negotiating your worth with society. You stop giving others the power to define who you are. This is not arrogance, this is liberation. It is the kind of liberation that comes from recognizing that your dignity has already been honored by the one who shaped you, guided you, and chose you to know Him. You see, much of our fear in life comes from feeling dependent on people, dependent on their approval, their praise, their validation, their acceptance. We fear disappointing them, fear losing them, fear falling below their standards, and these fears can quietly enslave us. They push us to compromise, to pretend, to perform. But when the heart bows sincerely to Allah, something inside shifts. Suddenly, the fear of people loses its grip. You realize that the only approval that truly matters is the approval of the one who knows you completely. And when that becomes your compass, the world's pressure weakens. Think about how different life looks through that lens. When you no longer bow to status, you stop chasing it desperately. When you no longer bow to wealth, you stop letting it dictate your self-worth. When you no longer bow to societal trends, you stop reshaping yourself to fit in. You begin to live with integrity. You stand firm in your values, not because it's easy, but because they're anchored in something unshakable. The person who bows to Allah walks through this world with a quiet confidence, a confidence that doesn't need to shout. They know who they are, and they know whose they are. And that stability becomes deeply psychological. Human beings crave something solid, something constant, something reliable. But everything in this world is unstable. People change, circumstances shift, opportunities come and go. If your emotional equilibrium rests on anything created, it will eventually shake. That's why those who anchor their hearts in Allah display an uncommon resilience. They are not easily swayed by criticism, nor inflated by praise. They don't collapse when life becomes unpredictable, because their definition of success isn't tied to the dunya. It's tied to obedience. There is also a philosophical dimension to this freedom. Every human being submits to something: desire, pressure, ambition, ego, culture, or people. In reality, no one is truly independent. The question is simply, what do you submit to? The believer makes a conscious choice to submit to the one who has absolute authority, absolute wisdom, and absolute mercy. And in that submission, every other worldly force loses its authority. You are no longer governed by external noise. You are guided by internal clarity. This clarity shows in your behavior. You begin to speak with more honesty because you are not performing for an audience. You carry yourself with dignity because you are not begging for validation. You make decisions with courage because you are not paralyzed by what will they think. You protect your values fiercely because you fear losing Allah far more than losing people. This is not defiance. This is freedom. And once you taste it, you don't want to return to the emotional slavery of needing approval from every direction. So when you bow to Allah, you rise above the world not physically, but spiritually, emotionally, intellectually. You rise above the opinions that used to intimidate you, the doubts that used to weaken you, the pressures that used to overwhelm you. You rise because your heart is not scattered anymore. It is centered. It belongs to one master, not many. And that is the essence of empowerment. When your forehead touches the ground, nothing else can bring you down. Bow to Allah so deeply that nothing in this world feels worthy of your surrender. If you observe the pattern of spiritual growth, you'll notice that strength rarely emerges from moments of ease. It is almost always born from struggle, from vulnerability, from surrender. And sajda is the most honest form of surrender a believer can offer. When you bow to Allah, you are not just expressing worship. You are releasing the burdens you carry, admitting the limits you hide, and seeking strength from the only source that never runs out. There is something incredibly transformative about placing your head, the highest part of your body, on the ground for the sake of the one who created you. It becomes a reminder that every rise begins with a fall, and every elevation begins with a bow. This is why sajda is often the turning point in a person's life. In that moment of prostration, you see yourself without pretense. You acknowledge your fears, your shortcomings, your mistakes, your hopes. And the remarkable thing is that Allah does not humiliate the one who humbles themselves before Him. He strengthens them. The world tells you to hide your weaknesses. Allah tells you to bring them to Him. And this shift in approach changes everything. Emotionally, mentally, spiritually. You walk out of sajda lighter, clearer, and more grounded because you have handed your fragility to the one who can transform it into resilience. From a psychological perspective, sajda becomes a form of deep emotional processing. Humans tend to suppress their struggles, thinking this makes them stronger. But suppressed pain doesn't disappear. It leaks into our reactions, our relationships, and our decisions. When you bow to Allah, you give yourself permission to feel, to release, to heal. The act itself slows the nervous system, calms the breath, and creates a state of vulnerability that is safe rather than threatening. In sajda, you are no longer pretending to be in control. You are admitting your dependence, and in that admission, you find stability. That stability is what later appears as courage. Philosophically, this moment teaches a profound lesson. Strength is not something you create. It's something Allah grants. And the doorway to it is humility. When you bow, you are acknowledging that your power is limited, but Allah's power is limitless. You are admitting that your plan is imperfect, but His is flawless. You are surrendering your illusion of control so that true control, His control, can guide your life. This is what gives the believer a unique confidence. They are not strong because they trust themselves. They are strong because they trust Allah. And once that trust settles into the heart, your entire internal landscape changes. Hardship no longer feels like a dead end. It becomes a path to elevation. Failure no longer feels final. It becomes a lesson. Delays no longer frustrate you. They remind you that timing is not in your hands. Sajda trains the mind to see life differently. It cultivates patience, nurtures hope, and strengthens faith. You rise from the ground with a renewed capacity to face what once overwhelmed you. You rise with a posture of quiet strength that is not loud, not dramatic, but deeply rooted. People who consistently bow to Allah develop a kind of resilience that is difficult to explain but easy to recognize. They carry a calm that is not tied to circumstances. They move with purpose even when life is uncertain. They persist even when outcomes aren't guaranteed. Their strength is not the absence of struggle. It is the presence of Allah in their struggle. This is why the believer who bows often rises higher than they ever expected, because Allah elevates those who lower themselves before Him. So if you ever feel weak, broken, or overwhelmed, remember that your greatest strength is waiting in the place where your head meets the ground. Sajda is not the end of your power. It is the beginning of it. Bow with sincerity, rise with strength.